Gigabyte Thunderbolt 4. Content creation is finally getting the attention it deserves. Building a computer covers 5 components. Well, today we're going to be looking at 5 aspects of those components as it relates to number 1, Thunderbolt 4, number 2, content creation. It's important we're going to take a look at the chipsets because I want to take you and show you some links. And the information that I don't get to in this discussion for this description will be in the description for the video because there's a lot of stuff we want to cover and we want to make this as complete but keep it as short as we can. Then we need to talk about the pinout because everybody's doing something different. It's like who's on first. ASUS has their thing they're going to do. So as we talk about Gigabyte, we're going to talk about MSI, we're going to talk about ASRock, and we'll talk about ASUS because it's all relevant. And I'll tell you right now, as it relates to the pinout on the header. Okay, if you got ASUS, you're probably going to have to stick with ASUS. Why is that? If you got a 14-1 pin header, then that's what you're going to have. And another question comes up, well, what if I've got Thunderbolt 3? Can I get Thunderbolt 4? Well, that depends. Possibly, but it's probably going to be specific to the vendor because of the pinout. And here's kind of what we're facing. As I started to mention a while ago and to reiterate, ASUS has a 14-1 pin header. That's going to be set in stone. And Gigabyte has decided to use a 5-pin plus a 3-pin header. So the question again, if I have Thunderbolt 3, can I do Thunderbolt 4? On Gigabyte, it's a whole new game. Now, the one that's going to change everything and really set this thing on fire is going to be ASRock because ASRock is stuck with a 5-pin header. I want to show you motherboard on that and we'll go through some of the specs. But the party line from Intel is what we're going to have to focus on, and that party line is the Intel 500 series chipsets. We'll look at some of the chipsets and see how that plays out. The one kind of monkey wrench in the game is going to be ASUS because ASUS has decided to support on the ASUS ProArt B550 Creator AMD. So if you go Intel, you've got lots of options. But if you want to go AMD, you got one option. So as some other videos we're going to be doing, and by the way, folks, this is Builder Buy. I want to thank you guys for joining us. My name is Gil Boyd. Welcome. So the first thing we'll do once we get through this information as we cover those things, the next video we're going to look at what I'm going to call an entry-level machine because I'm going to spread this out as we look at number 1, Thunderbolt 4, and number 2, content creation, how that relates to 4 different classes of machines. Now, we've been doing high-end desktops, we've been talking workstations, but I'm getting so many questions, and as we look to see how this is positioned, even though everybody says content creation for Thunderbolt 4, well, from my perspective and my perception of content creation for machine, as I look at 4 classes of machines, we're going to look at an entry-level machine. That'll be the motherboard in the next video, but I'm going to tell you about it today. We're going to look at the secondary machine, which again is another motherboard that we'll look at that I'll tell you more about later. But the 3rd and 4th levels we've been looking at, the question is, can I get Thunderbolt 4 on those motherboards that support Thunderbolt 3? And those machines I'm talking about are the high-end desktop and the workstation. And there's only one vendor doing that, and that's Gigabyte. So if you've got a 5-pin header and you're on a Gigabyte motherboard for a high-end desktop or for a workstation, if you use the ASRock card according to that 5-pin header, it should work. I want to go through some of that. I want to show you because I've got some other questions that I've been asked that we're trying to solve, and it would be a lot easier if we can do it in a video and help everybody at one time. And as we look at these 4 classes of machines, we're going to balance that against another video we did, which is about the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula. Say that 3 times real fast. That's a mouthful. Okay, what is that formula? Number 1, CPU cores times 4 equals RAM. Number 2, CPU core count equals video RAM. And the video card is a problem. As we go back through this with 4 different levels of machines, that primary entry-level machine makes a lot more sense because you don't have to have a video card because video is built on the motherboard. So a machine, as I say, change one thing changes everything. A machine that I would not have messed with 6 months ago becomes more realistic because if I've got video on board, I can get Thunderbolt 4. If I've got video on board, I can always change to external video later and still have Thunderbolt 4. And I want to show how that works, Thunderbolt, whether it's from an internal GPU or whether it's through an external GPU. So let's get started and let's go over to the computer and we're going to take a look at what Gigabyte has to offer and we'll go through the specs and we'll get some questions answered as we split through this. But I hope this gives you something to start with. I want to thank one of our subscribers, Michael V. He sent this about the Gigabyte Thunderbolt 4 add-in card, and this is the Maple Ridge chipset. Remember, there's two Thunderbolt 4 chipsets. One is the Maple Ridge, and the other one I won't get into is a 4-port controller that we expect to see on laptops. Until we know more, there's no more talking about it other than this is the 2-port. When you hear Maple Ridge, 2-port. Now, what I will say, even with 4 ports, it's still the same bandwidth, which is 4 PCI Express lanes. So what do you get with 4 ports? Connectivity. But that does not mean you get more bandwidth. So one of the questions asked, how does Thunderbolt get the bandwidth with 4 PCI Express lanes? It doesn't. It's Intel marketing. But, once we get past that, for those of us that are data junkies, I want Thunderbolt connectivity, and I would like to have access to Thunderbolt 4, because remember, Thunderbolt 4 is USB compatible. And oh, by the way, have you guys heard? USB-C has just announced, okay, we're getting 100 watts, which I think is ridiculous. That's just my take, because I don't think power should be going on something like that. When you're talking data, you're talking data. Of the 3 things that Thunderbolt can do. So one being power, USB-C has now approved that they're going to do 240 watts through USB-C. So want to make sure those cables are right and make sure those cables are up to spec, or else that could be a problem. But the other issue is about video. And those that want to know how this thing with video works, that's why we're going to take a look at a couple of motherboards. We're only going to do unboxings so we can look at how that routing works. And I hope with the information we share, based on what we know, you'll know what we know, we'll all have a better understanding of this as we go forward. And of those 3 things that Thunderbolt can do, whether it's Thunderbolt 3 or Thunderbolt 4, to me only one makes sense. That's data connectivity. I like to be able to have my stuff hooked up where I can have access to whatever I'm doing, so I can send data here and send data there. And there's also a new media reader that's been announced that will possibly do another video that's going to be Thunderbolt 4. I believe SanDisk is the one that's coming out on it. So let's go back to the computer and let's check the specs. Okay, the Gigabyte Maple Ridge Thunderbolt 4, by the time you see this video or shortly thereafter, probably within a couple of weeks, this card should be available. Now this is an add-in card. What I want to do is let's scroll to the bottom, and the things I need to focus on are what's it going to take to implement it. Okay, here's the chipsets. Now this is really nice. This shows the Z590 and the B560. And if you'll notice down here in fine print, because another question came up, yes, I believe Franz was the one that asked this question. Thunderbolt 4, is it through the chipset or through the CPU? Thunderbolt, period, is through the chipset. And as we get further into this, I'll show you this, because what we're going to do is look at one motherboard and look at the diagram, and that block diagram will show how all that works out. We'll look at another motherboard so we can look at the pinout and see how all that works out. In the past, the one vendor that's done the very best job with documentation has always been ASUS, but right now the one doing the best job with Thunderbolt documentation happens to be ASRock. You want to see what's going on in the BIOS? ASRock. You want to click on the motherboards and go right to them? ASRock. It's just they're doing the best job. Which Gigabyte, well, they need a little help with their documentation. But we're gonna pull this information out. I mean, this one thing that I think is important about how we get support through the PCH, which is the Platform Controller Hub, which is the chipset. So 2 chipsets, the Z590 and the B560, and there are some other chipsets that the other vendors are supporting. It depends on their game plan. So from here, the thing to do would be to go and download the documentation, which would be the PDF file. So up here, we'll go to support, and the driver, it says this is for Windows 10, 20H2 supported, and this shows a file date of 3/4/21. We don't need the driver right now, although it would be good to download it. It would behoove us to do so. We need the manual, so we'll download the manual. And what we've got, we want to focus on, if you notice right here, the internal connectors. One 5-pin Thunderbolt header and one 3-pin Thunderbolt header. That's a little bit annoying, but it is what it is. So, we've talked about what ASUS is doing with that 14-1 pin header. And I don't get what those other 3 pins are for. But it really doesn't matter, because if ASRock has a solution, that's all that matters. But I want us to do this from the perspective of Gigabyte, because it is Gigabyte. Now the cables that come with this card, there's going to be 2 mini DisplayPort cables. Those are going to be crucial. Now you might ask, why are those cables crucial? Well, we've got to be able to, from a video card or video source, we have to take video out of that source and route it back into Thunderbolt. That's why that's important. So the cables to do that come with a Thunderbolt card. Some of the motherboards that have Thunderbolt built on, we'll look at that and show with that. But as it relates to this card, you've got to have those 2 cables. So you'll be going from mini DisplayPort to DisplayPort. Then we've also got the USB 2 header that allows for plug-and-play signaling. There is what we've had, the Thunderbolt 5-pin header and then a Thunderbolt 3-pin header. Back to the requirements for the motherboard, we're going to take a look at one of these motherboards, and we are going to pick, let's go to the Z590, and let's go for Vision D if I can find it. Now the motherboard I'm going to show you is not listed on this document. They show a Z590 Vision G, but we're going to take a look at the Z590 Vision D. Now the Z590 Vision D, this is a red dot winner for 2021. It's a beautiful board. We've got 3 slots. I believe that's a 16 lane, an 8 lane, and a 4 lane slot. Now looking at the back I/O panel, we chose this because this particular motherboard has Thunderbolt 4 built on. This motherboard is also going to have a CPU that has video built on, and that's significant because once we look at this, we're going to look back at the documentation. We'll download the PDF file, see how that plumbing works. We have 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports coming out, and right here we have DisplayPort in. That is for an external video card. So if you plug in an external video card, you have to plug video into this to get video out of this, out of a Thunderbolt 4 port. Now this HDMI port is for video out, but if you want to put video in from an external source, it comes in through there. For clarity, we're going to take a look now at the PDF file, and I think if we look at the diagram, it'll be more like an aha moment to understand, because the block diagram to understand how this all works with chipsets. Looking at the Z590 Vision D motherboard diagram, if you'll notice right here, the Thunderbolt 4 controller. And when we get through this, we'll take a look at a layout of the motherboard so you can see where that chipset is on the motherboard. It's a separate chipset. What's important at this point is to understand the routing. The Thunderbolt 4 controller is routed through the chipset. That's 4 PCI lanes for Thunderbolt 4. And then coming out of Thunderbolt 4 are 2 USB-C ports. That's how everything comes out. Here's the key, is the switch. If video is in this CPU, it comes out to that switch and goes back into Thunderbolt. If you plug in external video, it again goes through that switch, which on the connector on the back of the motherboard comes in right there. So we're going to look further down on the document now that you understand the block diagram. And I believe that John Smith had commented, his Thunderbolt 3 card, after all we'd done still in the box, he thought, what a headache. Well, I'll just say PITA after what we went through with the firmware updates. But as you get into Thunderbolt 4, this problem kind of grows, but I'm hoping we've got a handle on it to understand those pins and how all that works out. So if you still got your Thunderbolt 3, it needs the firmware update. But is it possible for you to do Thunderbolt 4 based on what ASRock has to offer? Yes, and I'll get to that in a minute. Let's take a look at the Z590 Vision D motherboard layout. And all I did was search the document for Thunderbolt 4 controller. And there's our controller chip in relation to everything else on the board. Now more than likely, that's going to be required to go in this bottom slot, PCI Express Bus 4. And the connector for that, no connector, because it's built on the motherboard. So remember that. Thunderbolt 4 is built onto the motherboard, but it is a separate chipset. And that is routed to the video and back out through one of these Thunderbolt 3 ports over here. And there's a switch, if you're using internal video, that automatically sends to, and I would expect, port 1. Now, according to the documentation with this particular motherboard, which again is the Gigabyte Z590 Vision D, and this is a motherboard we'll be looking at some more later, just an unboxing. Integrated graphics processor plus Intel Thunderbolt 4 controller. 1 Vision Link Thunderbolt connector, Intel Thunderbolt 4 USB-C port. So that's going to be video coming out. 1 Intel Thunderbolt 4 connector USB-C. Again, Thunderbolt coming out. So the Vision Link and the Intel Thunderbolt 4 connectors support DisplayPort and Thunderbolt video outputs for a maximum resolution. Wow, 8K. At this time, I'm only aware of one 8K monitor. I believe it's Dell. And I got to say this right now. If I'm looking for a monitor, and we're going to look at some monitors and step up through those. Number 1, I'm looking at a monitor for content creation. Number 2, because of content creation, I want something that can do color matching. If Thunderbolt is on a monitor, fine, but that's not the primary reason I'm looking for it. Number 1, content creation. Number 2, to be able to color grade. That's pretty fascinating if someone's going to go buy that 8K monitor and do that. But again, the technology, there's going to be more coming online. But I wanted to point that out. Now take note, because of the limited I/O resources of the PC architecture, the number of Thunderbolt devices that can be used is dependent on the number of the PCI Express devices being installed, and refer to the back panel connectors. So there's only so many resources. That's what kind of surprises me about putting Thunderbolt being positioned for content creators. Okay, I think that's a great idea, but for content creators on machines with limited resources. I'm I'm not okay with that, and I don't fully understand that. I'm trying to wrap my mind around it. So I'm trying to share with you guys where I'm coming from so we're on the same page. Thunderbolt ought to be applicable on higher end machines. But if ASRock follows through with what they're talking about and they deliver, we'll have it. But again, this is about where we're at with Gigabyte. Now the integrated graphics on this will support 4K 30. Wow. It will not support 4K 60. But you can get out of Thunderbolt 8K. But it's not going to happen with the internal graphics. And 4K 30 is pretty simple. We've got a vendor that's contacted us about cables because of the issues right now with bandwidth that wants to take a look at one of these new fiber HDMI cables. So that's something else we're going to be looking at that we're going to talk about. Because I've always said, you know, anything beyond 7 or 8 feet with HDMI, forget it. But when you start punching this kind of data and you go from 4K 30 to 4K 60, that's a big deal. But when you start talking pushing 8K, that's a really big deal. So that kind of cable matters. And there's been a bug with receivers on HDMI 2.1. They're finally getting that sorted out. But, you know, bleeding edge, it is what it is. But I wanted to point this stuff out because it's going to come up, believe me. Now, in this motherboard manual, it shows the display port in. And that card it's coming out of, that's a video card. So you're taking video out of the video card and looking at steps 1 and 2. And then you're bringing video back in. And all I'm doing is a search on the word Thunderbolt within this document where it talks about the display port in port. And that display port in port, if you'll notice, this is video coming out of a video card, a separate video card. So video comes out of that video card and goes and is ingested back in. So once that video is ingested back in, then it'll come back out through the Thunderbolt port. And my expectation would be, because there's only one port coming out. And if you notice here in step 2, connect the display port or Thunderbolt devices to the VisionLink Thunderbolt connector to complete. VisionLink implying that's the one that's going to have video. So I hope the distinction of that clarification is going to be helpful. It's going to be coming up. It's been coming up. It's going to keep coming up. But I'm going to try to clarify it. Our goal is, number 1, to keep it simple. Number 2, make it work. So it's interesting to note here that'll get 60 watts. That doesn't get 100 watts. Very important to know. Well, 60 watts is still down at Thunderbolt 3. Because Thunderbolt 4 is supposed to do 100 watts. And here it talks about the connector, supports a resolution 4K 60 when a graphics card is connected to the display port in port for the VisionLink Thunderbolt connector to output. The actual resolutions supported are dependent on the monitor being used. It's always the details. Now it's really nice here they talk about a sub-menu that talks about Thunderbolt, but they don't show you that sub-menu. When we get to the ASRock, there's a little bit more information that ASRock shares in that sub-menu that's kind of nice to know. That's one of the reasons it's nice to hook one of these up so we can show that information on a screen so we can see what that all looks like. I like the details. I think it matters. But they didn't ask us. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on MSI other than to say that MSI is implementing Thunderbolt 4, but it's built onto the motherboard. So since there's not an I/O card, there's no way to talk about pinout. We don't know what they're doing. And until they do, there's no point in getting any more into it. But you can go take a look. I'll have a link. What I want to do now is let's take a look at the machines as we look at 4 classes of machines that we'd build so we can see how Thunderbolt 4 and content creation fits into that scheme. We're going to go to PC Part Picker. Now, of the 4 levels of machines, this machine is a 10-core. Now, this 10-core processor has video built in. Everything right now is in such a state of flux. I'm going to have these links up so you can look at this information. And as these products become available, we'll get these links up on Amazon. Appreciate you guys supporting us. So we have our key components. RAM, motherboard, processor. I went ahead and put a cooler on there. You can change coolers whatever you like. I'm still using Noctua. It works for us. And this is RAM, motherboard, and processor based on the Adobe After Effects multi-frame CPU optimization rendering formula. So we have 10 cores. 10 cores would be 40 gigs of RAM. 40 gigs of RAM, we've got this set up with 64 gigs. So you can allocate some memory to Thunderbolt. And this motherboard, we're showing the Gigabyte Z590 Vision D. LGA, that's a socket 1200 on that motherboard. In the next video, we're probably going to be taking a look and doing an unboxing on that motherboard just to look at the technology and get a little closer hands-on inspection. Okay, let's move up the food chain and look at a 16-core machine. Now this link I have at PC Part Pickers for 16-core. This is based on an AMD Ryzen 9 5950. That's the 5000 series CPU, and the only motherboard that supports that is the ASUS ProArt B550 Creator. And the first person I had talked about with this motherboard was, I believe, Tim Ottman, one of our subscribers as well. Thank you, Tim, for sharing that information with us. So I asked him, I said, did you get your motherboard? He said, not only do I have it, he's up and running on it. I said, how was it? Great. I said, how was the Windows install? Did you have any BSODs? Because I was concerned about Thunderbolt. He said, no problem. He breezed right through it, up and running. It's already in production. So great. So that too is another motherboard that we have we're going to be taking a look at. And by the way, we have also, yes, we have the ASUS Thunderbolt 4 add-in card, and we're going to be doing another video separate about that card because there's a possibility we may be able to get it running without BIOS support. Another video. Stay tuned. But I had to share this with you on this class of machine, 16 cores, again 64 gigs of memory, and with that particular motherboard. Now this says that processor is not available. I will say that the processor looks like it's going up on list price by about $50. Right now it's going to be about availability. Everybody is after that processor, but because this seems to be what they classify as a lower end processor, they're kind of hard to get. According to information I've read, both Intel and AMD are concentrating on the high end processors. So, you know, we got things going this way and we got things going that way, and we feel like we're doing this. So I'm going to share with you what I got. This is easy to watch, so you don't have to hunt, but still sometimes it's a good idea because I've never seen a link here that goes into Micro Center. And I will say when Micro Center has had that processor, they'll show like 25 in the area. So you might want to check that, drill down, check your area, and see if you can get your hands on one if you want to build that machine. So to think about it this way, if I'm going to build Intel, I go this direction. If I want to build AMD, I go that direction. The other thing you have to consider is the pinout on all these. If I'm going to do an add-in card, is it a 14-1 pin, which is ASUS? Is it going to be what Gigabyte does, which is a 5-pin and a 3-pin? Is it going to be what MSI does, which again is built on the motherboard? Or is it going to be what ASRock is doing, which is a 5-pin header, which means anywhere I've had a 5-pin header, that card should work. So I'm a little excited and kind of giddy about it. I want to get my hands on one. So if you guys find that card before I do, let me know, because we need to try it. High-end desktop, and I haven't mentioned high-end desktops on anything other than the TRX 40 for the reason being PCI Express 4. So let's take a look at that. And of the third level machines, as I classify for a high-end desktop, this is starting with the Threadripper 3970. We've got 32 cores, and this is on the Gigabyte TRX 40 Designaire motherboard. At this point in time, this is extremely relevant because of all 4 classes of machines we looked at. The first level, which is on an Intel CPU motherboard. The second level, which will let us use the ASUS B550 ProArt, so we have number 1, Thunderbolt 4, number 2 for content creation. But as we step up the food chain, there's a little bit of a space. It's kind of like video cameras. You go from a $300 video camera to a $1,300 video camera. What's the difference in between? Nothing you want to mess with. And once you get to that point, what's the difference in a $1,300 camera versus a $3,300 camera? They're not apples and apples. They're apples and oranges. The differences are extreme. But just for the purpose and for the sake of this discussion, for this formula, as we go in this food chain, looking at 4 classes of machines. Number 1, Thunderbolt 4. Number 2, content creation. Now, I put this in the mix because this, I believe, is the best bang for the buck, because 1, you get a motherboard, and 2, you get 2 add-in cards. One of those add-in cards is Thunderbolt 3 5-pin header. The other add-in card that everybody keeps asking about, and I got to tell you, we've had more questions about the M.2 cards of anything we've done. M.2 number 1, Thunderbolt number 2. But this motherboard includes those 2 items. Now, Gigabyte had originally announced on their workstation, on their WRX80, that they were going to include those 2 cards. When that finally came out, all that information got scrubbed, and the only thing you could find out about that with the original intent, even the press release got scrubbed, was if you looked at news that somebody else put out about it. So the only reason for the workstation to go with the Gigabyte is that 5-pin header. Those 2 add-in cards, gone. And if you got that Thunderbolt 3 5-pin header on a TRX 40 or WRX80, for the WRX80, the ASRock card, if they stay true to that. And I'm going to show that in just a second. But I want to show you this because of all 4 classes of machines for what you can build right now. Of those 5 components, RAM, motherboard, and processor, it's easier to get a processor on the high end or the bottom end. It's that mid-range on that B550 ProArt Creator. It's a hard time getting the processor. On the high end, though, on any of the machines, we're having trouble getting video cards. And on a workstation with a power supply, we've got 4 options for building one. But if we change one thing that changes everything, say we want to build into a rack mount case, That's a whole nother conversation that we're going to address, because we've got two options that we need to talk about. Another video. So let's go back to these specs and let's go see what ASRock is doing. And this is exciting. Now the ASRock Thunderbolt 4 card has probably got the best documentation of anybody going. And I like the way they've got this laid out. If we look at the external connectors, on the surface, we don't learn a lot. 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 1 Thunderbolt header. It doesn't say what. And to figure that out, let me show you how to find it. First thing we need to do, we'll go to Support, Support List, and right there. All these are on the Intel chipset with the socket 1200, so they support the B560, the H570, and the Z590. So if we look at the Z590, let's look at the Z590 Extreme, that particular motherboard. If we go to Support, let's pull down the manual, Z590 Extreme, and if we do a search on Thunderbolt, the first menu it takes us to is what's going on in the BIOS. And in a manual, that's the best documentation I've seen. Discrete Thunderbolt support enabled, Thunderbolt boot support, Thunderbolt USB support, Titan Ridge workaround, interesting, and a Windows 10 Thunderbolt support. Now my expectation, even though that says Titan Ridge workaround, that should reflect something that says Maple Ridge. Because remember, the Titan Ridge was the previous Thunderbolt 3. We're now talking Maple Ridge, which is Thunderbolt 4. So based on this documentation, I don't know how correct all this is, but what they're telling us, here's the next thing we need to see. Right there. And we're on this page that talks about the connectors and other connectors. That says 1 Thunderbolt add-in connector, 5 pins, supports the ASRock Thunderbolt 4 add-in card. 5 pin, folks. That's the key to our success. And if we go on down a little further and we see the motherboard connections, I'm going to scroll back up, and right here, number 33, you see what I see. A 5-pin Thunderbolt header right next to that PCI Express 3 slot, which will be a 4-lane slot. Now I think that's pretty slick. Right there is going to be our key to getting Thunderbolt 4 on a motherboard that supported Thunderbolt 3 with a 5-pin header. And only that one 5-pin header. None of that extra mumbo jumbo stuff. So I don't know what's going on with the pins. I got to looking at that and I was going to do the video on that, but then I kind of stepped back from it and I said, wait a minute. There's got to be a simpler solution to it. Right now, this looks to be it. So we got to stay tuned and see what happens. But so far, you know what I know. And as I've said before, I know enough to know that I need to know more. But I know enough right now that I'm stoked about it. So 4 different classes of computers. Number 1, we're looking at Thunderbolt 4. Number 2, we're looking at content creation. Next up, I've got a whole lot more information, but I wanted to keep this short and just hit the high points and give you guys something you could bite into. Entry-level machine, PC part picker. Secondary machine, we're looking at the AMD B550 ProArt. So that first machine in that link to PC part picker, we're going to take a look at that motherboard. Then we're going to take a look at the Asus B550 ProArt Creator. And the third machine that we've been talking about all the time, which I think is the best bang for the buck, is the Gigabyte TRX40 Designaire. Now, how we're going to approach this with what we're going to do on the WRX80 based on Thunderbolt 4, I think you kind of know where I stand. But until we get a little bit further, I don't have enough information to make that a solid answer. But I'm leaning toward Gigabyte. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I appreciate you watching. Look forward to seeing you next video. We're out.